Hey guys. I had an idea for a video when I realized I owned several mice which had identical switches to each other. I thought it might be fun to try and show you how the same switch in different shells feels and sounds slightly different. Um, I know to some extent this might look like a flex. It's not. I'm sitting here feeling pretty embarrassed about my financial decisions because I don't think I realized I owned this many mice. But anyway, I'll try and justify my spending by helping hopefully inform some of you guys and give some extra insight into different switches and what they feel and sound like. Um, so I'll try to just go through and do a sound test first and then talk about feel. I recorded a much longer version of this video previously where I did more talking and less clicking. And a lot of you are probably going to be getting bored from that. So anyway, here you go. First up, we have Kailh GM 8s. These are probably the most popular switch on new mice right now, so a lot of you will be familiar with them. But for those of you who aren't, they're on the lighter side of switches. They're sort of less stiff than average, and they have a kind of higher pitched click sound, and they're very crisp and sharp in their click feel, and they have very little travel prior to the click actuating. So to start with is the Mionix Naos Pro. This guy comes from the factory with GM8s. So next up we have the Xenics G Air SE. I've modded this mouse to have GM8s in it, but basically the end result is now this is pretty similar to what you'd get from a Ponage Ultra Custom Ergo Gen 2. So it has the same 3370 sensor and the same GM8 switches. You can hear there's a little bit of a feel of kind of plastic rubbing on plastic with this mouse. I don't have a good solution to that right now. I wish it wasn't there, but I think that's just part of the way the shell is designed to prevent the buttons from wobbling side to side. Oh, and for clarity, yes, this is exactly the same shape as the Ponage Ultra Custom mice. That's why I brought it up. Just the Xenix version doesn't have the holes on the side. Anyway, the last GM8 powered mouse that I've got for you is my OG MX518 that I've swapped the switches on. It's kind of a general, it's kind of a general comment. Mice with this type of design where the whole top shell is one long piece, you'll notice the Naos is similar to that, tend to have clicks that feel mushier and less tactile when using the same switches as other mice. This applies to Zowie mice as well, and that's why I chose to put GM8s in this mouse. I needed that extra crispness, that extra tactility to try and cut through the sort of mushiness that the shell design creates. So similarly speaking, if you have a Zowie mouse and you want to improve the click feel, even though I don't blanket recommend GM8s for every mouse in existence, I think they are a good match for Zowie mice as well as like the Death Adder, where they have that long one-piece top shell. Next up, we've got Kailh GM 4s. So these are a slightly stiffer version of the GM8, basically. I think typically they sound slightly lower in pitch, but they're similarly crisp and tactile. So here's the Asus TUF M4 Wireless, which comes from the factory with GM4s. Here is a Corsair Sabre Pro Wireless. This mouse normally has Omron 50 millions, but I modded it to have GM4s. You'll notice the hollow sound. That's from the spring tensioning system in the buttons on these mice. That's pretty universal for mice with spring tension switches like the G303. You can hear the same thing. In general, spring tensioning will make the clicks feel slightly lighter than other mice, which would be otherwise identical, because they put some force onto the switch in order to remove the pre-travel or tension, or lack of tension. When the switch wants to rebound up off, the spring pulls them back down into contact. But they don't want to use too stiff of a spring, or it can ruin the click feel. And that's why you get this rattly noise, because the springs just aren't stiff enough to actually resist any sort of pull upward. Okay, finally we have the Gamesense MVP Wireless. This is another mouse that comes from the factory with GM4s. In fact, I believe every single switch on this mouse is a GM4, which is pretty cool. In doing my own testing with sort of loose GM4s that I've purchased off Amazon that weren't sorted or previously installed in mice, comparing them against GM8s, I've noticed that some of them do seem to have a little bit more pre-travel in the actual switch itself prior to where the click actuates compared to GM8s. But I don't notice any meaningful difference in the amount of travel allowed prior to click in any of these 6 mice when comparing them right now. So I don't think whatever I felt might have been there is significant enough to affect your decision. All Kailh GM switches do a good job of removing some of that initial travel prior to the click actually actuating. The GM2s do this as well, even though they're actually a less sharp click feeling than the GM4s and the GM8s, so they don't feel quite as crisp. All right, so next up we've got Huano Blue Shell Pink Dots. These, to my mind, are basically Huano's competitor to the GM4, but they're rated for even more clicks. They're in the same stiffness range. They're stiffer than GM8s, but they're, again, very crisp, very tactile, pretty sharp click. The one distinguishing feature on the Huanos is that they seem to have slightly more rebound force, which means that if you're spam clicking, they'll come up slightly faster, but they take a little bit more force to hold clicked down. So anyway, this is the Ninjutso Katana Superlight. The wired version, I believe, uses GM8s. It did when it launched anyway, but the wireless version uses blue shell pink dots. So okay, next up we have my Makalu 67. This mouse comes from the factory with the dreaded 50 million Omrons. So I got tired of how kind of mushy the clicks were, and I wanted to swap them out for something crisper, so I went full hog and put blue shell pink dots in here. And now they are very crisp. One thing that's interesting to note is that if a mouse has a solid shell, but a lot of empty space in the middle of it, sometimes the shell can almost act like an echo chamber and create a more hollow sound to the clicks. You'll notice this with the Katana, but I also found this to be an issue with the Zowie EC1C, because the C series mice, they did so much effort to remove weight from the mice that you ended up with a similar type of construction where you have a base plate and then the top shell and then a lot of empty space in the middle. And when there's no holes, it creates that kind of echoey effect. The Makalu still has a very kind of higher pitched, sharp sounding click than the blue shell pink dot does in some other mice, but it's not hollow in the same way because all the holes in the shell prevent it from acting as this kind of echo chamber in the same manner. Anyway, as a final comparison point, this is my modified MX518. It has a GM4 on the left click, but it's a very abnormally lightweight GM4, which is less tactile as a result, and a Huano blue shell pink dot on the right click. The reason for this odd pairing is that the left click is actually placed closer to the front of the mouse on the MX518, and it means that I need a stiffer switch for the right click, a stiffer and more tactile click for the right, or switch for the right click, in order to make them feel consistent in their stiffness and their tactility. So this is a GM4, but it's mounted very close to the front of the mouse and feels stiffer and more tactile than how it measures on my scale, or to my fingernail when I test it outside of the mouse. And that's the blue shell pink dot. Now, if you'll notice, there is a certain extent to which that particular shell seems to be a little bit less crisp in its clicks than the GM8s. So maybe I'm onto something where the GM4s and the blue shell pink dots aren't nearly as crisp as a GM8, but I'm not sure, like I said. Right, next up we've got not blue shell pink dots, but black shell pink dots. These are the switches that Vaxee use in all their mice, and they're similar to the blue shell pink dots that Zowie use, black shell blue dots that Zowie use. Jeez, too many blues and blacks. Anyway, but instead the pink dot with the black shell tends to result in a lower pitched click sound, and I believe Vaxee went for this particular Huano switch because the design of their mice were making the clicks sound higher pitched out of the box. So here's a matte outset with Tiger Ice, but nothing inside has been modified. This just happens to be a copy with very good QC. There's no rattle or looseness in that scroll wheel operation, for example, and the sides and everything. Anyway, it's a really good copy. Now, for example, compare that to the same black shell pink dots in a G703. Notice how they sound a bit duller and lower pitched in this Logitech shell? I think that's why Vaxee opted for that particular switch, is they're some of the lowest pitched and kind of least orally AUR, as in sonically obnoxious switches that you can get. And then just for reference, here's my modified outset, which is a slightly worse QC copy, but the grip tape also does affect the click sound slightly, so. And that's just because the rubbery grip tape material sits on top of the plastic and changes the vibration characteristics of the material, right? So anyway, those are all the mice I own that share switches with each other. I also have a G303 SE, as I mentioned. This has the typical silver-coated 20 million Omrons marked G1 that Logitech is putting in all their mice now, as of about a year ago. So it's the same switches as the Superlight. It's the same switches that you get in a new 703 or a new GPW. But the way that the shell is designed, they feel crisper and more tactile and slightly stiffer than they do in the other Logitech mice. So that's about the best version of an Omron 20 million that you'll get as a comparison to these other switches. And then finally, we've got the Roccat Titan Opticals and the Kone Pro. These are a bit controversial, not because I find that they're actually bad, but they have a couple of things that people typically don't like about certain switches. So for one, they feel the amount of tactility and the force is actually fine. They're not like overly light and they're not super mushy, but they have a very rounded click feel. And what I mean by that is, remember how I was talking about the actual click actuation of the Kailh GM8s take place over a very short window of motion? These are the opposite. The click feel takes place over quite a long motion. So they have what I would call a much more rounded click feel. As a result, they don't feel sharp or aggressive, and they're easy to click relatively quickly with for a long period of time. But in general, I do find these switches trickier to click at the same speed as something like a GM8, whereas these are harder to get to that same level of speed with. They're almost like a marathon runner instead of a sprinter as far as switches go. Anyway, I'm sure that's way more analogies than you ever wanted. Hopefully this was helpful. If you guys have questions about other switches, I have tried more than I've shown here on mice that I've sold or switches that I tried and swapped back out. So maybe I can answer your questions. But basically, this is a collection of mice that I like, primarily with switches that I like. And so these are probably some of the switches that you'd find me recommending most often. I think potentially, again, the Kailhs tend to be a bit overrated for a lot of mice, but they are very, very good anytime you have this kind of one piece top cover with these really long triggers. And they do still work well in mice like the G703, that type of thing. There's nothing wrong with them. I just don't think that they deserve the level of kind of adoration and put them in everything, they're the best switch on the market sort of reputation that they seem to have on the subreddit right now. Personally, the blue shell pink dots are my favorites. But mice like the Makalu, where the shell design puts the switch towards the front, the click force is starting to get stiff enough that I don't think that it's an optimal switch for this mouse. So that's the main thing. If every mouse on the market would feel like it had the right amount of click force for me with blue shell pink dots, I'd put blue shell pink dots in everything. I think the extra rebound force combined with the slightly deeper tone than the GM switches and the extra rebound force and still having all of the crispness and tactility is a really, really nice combination. But they can be genuinely too stiff and disruptive as a result. So if I have a mouse that is, too, it just doesn't work with those switches, I'd want something lighter and still crisp in most cases, so maybe a GM8. I'd like to try the Japanese Omron D2F F37s. I think those are potentially very good, but I haven't had a chance to try them yet. And I also need to try the Zippy DF3 P1s. So maybe one of those switches would become my favorite alternative if blue shell pink dots are too stiff. But for now, either a GM8, a Huano black shell pink dot, or Huano blue shell white dot are probably my default recommendations.